Hey, Doc T here. I get inundated in my mail, all sorts of magazines about horses with all sorts of interesting articles. And I just received The Horse, which is Your Guide to Equine Healthcare, according to its subtitle. And it's automatically sent to all members of the American Association of Equine Practitioners, the AAP. And I find this one kind of amazing because they are a direct um, center of information being sent to horse owners everywhere with what could be really good articles, but they need somebody to counter what they say. And I've decided that every once in a while, maybe it might be more often than that, I'm going to take an article that I think is of value and analyze it and make sure that it's giving you the correct information or the complete information. I don't think anything they tell you is wrong. I think they just skew things. And the one that I'm looking at right now is titled Don't Gamble with Green Grass: How to Manage Horses and Their Pastures to Prevent Laminitis. So I've decided that I'm going to read this article to you and then interject my opinions and alternatives. So you can grab your copy of The Horse if you have it. If not, you can hear it. It's written by a person named Corey Traylor. And I don't know Corey Traylor's, it doesn't say who she is or what her credentials are. But I'm just gonna read it. It starts off by saying grazing is a natural exercise for equids. I love that. Grazing is an exercise. Okay. I've seen a lot of horses that don't get much exercise grazing, but that's okay. I understand her point. It means that horses spend a lot of time outside eating. Um, and she suggests that it is without risk. For some horses, over ingesting certain grasses can lead to laminitis, a painful, life threatening hoof disease that can be fatal in severe cases. It occurs when the lamina, the tissues that suspend the coffin bone of the hoof capsule, become damaged and inflamed. Now, it's springtime when I'm recording this in the Northeast United States. So the temperatures are getting warmer, daylight's getting longer, and uh, grass is growing. And this is an often asked question: how do I introduce my horse to this green grass? And there are so many issues that go in hand in this that it's worthy of a long podcast. So let me dive into it. By the way, I just listened to another podcast on laminitis, and I thought it was fascinating because there were four veterinarians on the Platinum Performance podcast that were discussing laminitis, and that's a whole nother one I should talk about. And of the four veterinarians, two of them were also farriers, and they dug deep into what causes or what is laminitis, how you can treat it. But when it got down to what's the cause of laminitis, it was a very short segment, and they all agreed it was obesity. And obesity is an epidemic, not just in horses, but in humans. And we're all trying to dig in and understand it. And I think that I'm getting a grasp of it. I'm understanding that it's sugar based. And yet I was at a client's house the other day who believed that sugar is actually the best nutrient to be taking in. And it was just an interesting um, opposition to what all the research and science is saying, that most muscles in mammals prefer fat for fuel. But let me stick with this Don't Gamble with Green Grass article. The author goes on to say, so what is it about grass that creates such an issue for these animals? It boils down to the density of non-structural carbohydrates. And it's interesting that hay and grass is divided into two categories: structural and non-structural carbohydrates. And carbohydrates, as we all know, are basically sugar. Carbohydrate means carbon plus hydrogen plus oxygen. And that can be put together in many different ways. Um, and the way it's put together, it will determine whether it's glucose or fructose. Or if you take a molecule of glucose and fructose and put it together, you have sucrose. And a lot of people will call these starches, but technically starch is glucose that's stacked in a nice, neat row on a shelf in a closet. Like if you have a whole bunch of shoes in boxes, you stack it in there. That's what starch is in a plant. And just as a side note, if you look at the collection of glucose in an animal, all animals, we call that glycogen. And glycogen is stored a little bit differently. They have branches, but in plants, it's just row upon row upon row of glucose that's neatly stacked together. It goes on to say that when a horse digests non-structural carbohydrates, also known as NSCs, his body breaks them down into glucose and fructose, which the small intestine absorbs. This can result in an increase in blood glucose concentration that can trigger an insulin surge. Well, it's not that it can, it does. Whenever you put glucose into the mouth, whether it's you or your horse or your dog or any other animal, insulin is triggered to be released from the pancreas. And insulin comes over and grabs it and transports it to the cell membrane. And there's a specific reason why that happens. So this sentence is, it can increase blood glucose. Well, it does. And it can trigger insulin surge. Well, it does. So the author goes on and says, in the horses that are predisposed to metabolic disorders, they when they ingest a high amount of non-structural carbohydrates, they secrete too much insulin. They actually don't secrete too much. They secrete the appropriate amount. Insulin is definitely driven by the amount of glucose that comes into the body. And the glucose has to be transported to the muscle cells, which is the largest consumer of glucose, with the second largest being the liver. And they store this glucose either in the muscle cells as glycogen or in the liver as glycogen. And what's interesting is it's all about how full you can store this glycogen or this glucose as glycogen. In other words, if your horse is growing rapidly, or if you're racing your horse or working your horse very hard, such as plowing fields, you can add the glucose and it'll be immediately stored, not only stored, but it'll actually be consumed as a fuel because they're working in excess of their needs of glucose. So what's happening here is if your horse doesn't need the glucose, then it's going to store it. And then once it gets stored, the cell will shut down its ability to absorb glucose. And that's fascinating because we all call this insulin resistance. And insulin resistance actually is a natural, normal, and healthy process of all animals that is created to occur when you're starving. And that should be messing your mind just a little bit, because when you are starving, there's no glucose. And your brain requires glucose every minute of your life. And in fact, it's been shown that if you don't have glucose constantly being produced and in circulation going to the brain, and the brain prefers glucose, that in 10 minutes you're dead. It's that simple. You are constantly making glucose in the liver, and the liver is either going to make glucose or it's going to use the glucose that's being stored as glycogen in the liver to go to the brain. And the brain is the boss. I hate to say it, but the brain is the boss. And if the brain ain't happy, it's going to steal glucose from wherever it can. And what's interesting is when you feed excess glucose in a more than a horse is going to consume through either growth or exercise, it's it's shut down at the cell at the cell wall through something called insulin resistance. And then insulin will take this glucose and say, okay, we're going to need this for later. And they go over to body fat and they shove it into a body fat cell. And the body fat cells continue to expand, to grow, and the horse gets obese. All animals will become obese when you consume more glucose than you can actually use. And if you think about it, if all sugar that's coming into the mouth can't be put into a cell, the only other option for that glucose molecule is to be put into storage as fat, as body fat, as fatty acids. There's so many different names for it. And they usually put 3 fatty acids onto a core molecule called glycerol, and it becomes triglycerides. And these triglycerides continue to stuff themselves into this little flexible cell called the fat cell, and expands and expands and expands. And this is where you get all your body fat from. But the most important thing to take away here is the glucose never makes it into the body for use by the brain. So when a horse becomes insulin resistant, the glucose is not disposed of properly. They call it glucose disposal. And that glucose is going to be stored as body fat. But what's more is insulin resistance also occurs in the liver, where insulin is not required to put glucose into glycogen as it is in the muscle cell. But it does trigger the liver to start making more glucose, because in reality, the horse is starving. Even though it's an abundance of glucose, it's starving. And as it starves, it needs more sugar for the brain. And if you're stressed, if you're thinking hard, if you're going to school, learning tasks, if you're just trying to make it through the day, you're consuming a lot of glucose in the brain, and the brain becomes sluggish. It also becomes resistant to other things. And now glucose is the only fuel being used in the brain. And you get brain fog, you get, where did I leave my car keys? Am I getting degenerative cognitive lesions in my brain? Am I going to end up like my parents with a little bit of dementia? And what's happening is you're actually getting what they call type 3 diabetes, and your brain isn't acting 100%. And this is what's going on in your horse. As you continue to eat sugar, they get similar conditions in their head. They're not happy. They're not great horses to be around. They get behavioral changes as the glucose keeps pumping out from conversion in the liver to keep the brain happy. There's no circulating fat that's actually getting into the brain, where if you really want to increase your intelligence or your ability to think, clarity of thought, how about that? You want to switch over to using ketones for the fuel in your brain. That's one of the secrets that all these people are saying, hey, if you want to become smarter, get away from sugar. It's the same idea. But here we are, don't gamble with green grass. And they're talking about these non-structural carbohydrates getting into your horse, which is increasing the starch load. And as your horse gets older and starts to, or decreases the amount of exercise they're getting, this sugar continues to create insulin resistance. So let's just talk about that for a second. If you have a horse that's getting obese, it's starting to get fat pads and a crusty neck, you don't need any fancy test. You can declare that your horse has insulin resistance. But a lot of people have horses that are in work, they're in some sort of training where they actually work hard. And now they're concerned, is my horse insulin resistant? And according to this article, the first thing this person says is that they look for a disease called, they call it pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, or PPID. They said formerly equine Cushing's disease. And I find that fascinating because um, this this whole scenario of the pituitary dysfunctioning and creating high cortisol levels, which by definition is Cushing's disease, is now declared by many people as a neurodegenerative disease. And it really is unrelated to, not directly related to increased sugar content. I would probably agree that if a horse has PPID or Cushing's disease, that they probably have insulin resistance. But they go on to say, or they can have high insulin as a standalone condition. So, in my way of thinking, your horse first becomes insulin resistant. The horse starts to consume their body proteins. And one of the proteins they will consume are, well, the amino acids that are needed to make dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, which is a protein. And so we end up medicating the horse with a medication for Cushing's disease, which is actually a replacement of dopamine. So it's basically confirming just with the treatment that it's a neurodegenerative disease. Okay, so let me go on. It says grasses and other plants photosynthesize to create sugar on sunny days. This is correct. It takes carbon dioxide, which we're breathing out. All animals are breathing out, and the plants take in the carbon dioxide and take water from the ground. And there's your carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and they create a molecule of glucose. And then they store that glucose in those nicely arranged long lines of glucose molecules after glucose after glucose. The article says the plant generate more and more sugar throughout the day. So each plant's sugar content is at its peak by the time the sun sets. Excuse me. And I think a lot of people agree with that. The author goes on to say, if the temperatures are above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so I went over to my trusty little calculator, and that means 4.4 degrees centigrade for all of our friends who use Celsius. Plants use these sugars to grow. Now, that was just a simple sentence. Let me elaborate on that. What happens to that long string of glucose is that every other glucose molecule gets flipped upside down. So in starch, it's glucose molecule after glucose after glucose after glucose in a repeating order. But at night when the sun goes down, the plant will take every other glucose molecule and actually flip it upside down and reattach it. And by doing so, it becomes structural carbohydrate. So it goes from a non-structural starch to a structural carbohydrate called cellulose. Now, what's really fascinating is, and they don't go over this at all, is that every animal on the planet can use starch to make glucose. So by eating starch, whether it's grasses for horses or potatoes and carrots are loaded in starch. The horse can convert that into glucose. So if you have a horse that's obese, stop feeding carrots. Sugar cubes, it doesn't matter. Any sugar source, but starch in particular can be digested by all animals into glucose. But structural carbohydrates, which are the cellulose, is every other glucose molecule is flipped upside down. And when that happens, we cannot digest them. And that is, to me, fascinating, because if you can't digest them, why are we eating them? Well, it turns out that in horses, they have that huge hindgut. We all know it. It's a big belly. And if it doesn't work right, we have a colic situation. We don't like colic. So we want to keep the gut happy. And what we mean by that is the trillions of bacteria that are inside the gut that are there for a reason. That specific reason is to take cellulose and break it down. Now, most of us know that sugar is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What we fail to realize is all fats are made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So it's the same three molecules, but just put together differently. Sugars are in a ring structure, so it's a ring, but fat is in a string. And the number of carbons that are used can grow from 4 carbons to 22 carbons plus. And the number of carbons will determine if it's a short chain fatty acid, a medium chain fatty acid, or a long chain. And the medium chain fatty acids are called medium chain triglycerides. And maybe many of you have heard of MCT oil, which is medium chain triglycerides. And in there are some of the fruits, such as olive oil, coconut oil. Coconut oil is probably your best source of medium chain triglycerides. But then you get the long chain triglycerides, and that's getting into the omega 6s and the omega 3s, which are 14, 16, 18, 20, 22 carbons long. And that has a whole different purpose for the horse, which I don't want to get into in this podcast. I'm just talking about whether we should turn horses out in the spring on green grass. So according to the article, if it's above 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius, overnight, the plants will convert this non-structural carbohydrate or starch into structural carbohydrate called cellulose. And cellulose actually becomes a fat source for the horse. I mean, everybody wonders, how does a horse get fat, or not fat, body fat, but how does it get the essential fats it needs to survive, to build the cell walls and to do the other necessary things, such as some of our hormones. And this is how it takes cellulose and it breaks it down into very short chain fatty acids, which are about 4 to 6 carbons long. Butyrate, acetate, and pyruvate, those are the short chain fatty acids. And by the way, butyrate is a short chain fatty acid of butter. That's why I like butter so much. So that's a high fat diet and the structural carbohydrates. But we're talking about the springtime and non-structural carbohydrates. So the author goes on to say, in the spring and fall, the ambient temperatures at night are too cool for the plant to use the sugar stores for growth, resulting in a higher concentration of sugars the next day. And the concentrations just get bigger and bigger every day. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I do know that the sugar concentration is everything, and that it varies. And it can vary according to the time of day, the temperature outside, the seasonality, because we all know that some of our pastures become dormant. They don't grow, but they're constantly getting sunlight. So I'll never forget the February, or was it December? But anyways, in the middle of winter, and is in upstate New York, and it's usually pretty cold, but we had a warm spell. I mean, it got into the 60s, and my phone started ringing with colics and with some laminitis cases. So I can understand that if it gets above a certain temperature, these grasses can start producing more starch, and that might be a trigger. But just put that in the back of your mind, that the sugar content of your pasture is going to fluctuate throughout the year. And it's like herding cats, I think, trying to chase it and understand it. I just think that trying to monitor the starch content of your grasses could be very difficult to do unless you're a scientist and have the analytical equipment, and you can go out there every day and test your pasture. So I think that's beyond most of us. So let's see, the article goes on. It said, when is grass a risk? And it says a common misconception is that the only time of the year grazing poses a risk to horses is the spring. But again, the issue depends more on where you live than what time of year it is. In maritime climates like the Pacific Northwest, the United Kingdom, and the coastal regions of Australia, there's no seasonality for laminitis. There isn't a lot of snow, and the grass stays green all winter long. So again, this basically is saying what I'm saying. Looking at your pasture, you can become frustrated because if your pasture is stressed, it's actually going to have a higher sugar content. If you fertilize your pasture, it's going to have a higher content, possibly. Um, if your pasture isn't fertilized, it becomes more stress. It can have a high sugar content. If you live down in South Florida, the sugar is going to be stored in its roots because the sunshine can sometimes become too hot. And they want to make sure that they have a food source, so they keep it underground where it stays cool and moist. Whereas the grasses up in the more temperate climates, the starch is stored in the leaves and above ground. So we have all sorts of, I don't know, I'm going to call it confusing, but complicated issues with the starch. And I find it fascinating that this article just continues on the line of looking at your pasture. And I say that there's other things that you have more control of. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I think the grasses, if you limit turnout for those that are metabolically unfit, that is definitely going to reduce the amount of sugar they're going to put in their mouth. The article goes on to a couple more segments. This one is your horse at risk? To determine how to manage horses on pasture, you may first identify the ones most risk for laminitis. Your veterinarians are suggesting to proactive owners that that all horses over the age of 15 get tested annually for ACTH, which is a pre-hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone. And excessive levels can lead to PPID, the Cushing's disease, and also test for insulin concentration. So I'm not sure if I'm agreeing with that, because they're suggesting that PPID is ahead of insulin. And here's where the problem lies. When your horse takes in more glucose than it needs, the blood glucose is going to rise, and your horse is going to put out insulin to counteract that and to drive the to drive the glucose into the muscle cells. That's its purpose. So the more glucose you have, the more insulin is going to be created. But if your horse is pre-cushingoid, what am I saying? Forget what I just said. If your horse is pre-insulin resistant, the glucose is going to rise, insulin is going to rise, and that's what's supposed to happen. But what happens is when you take a meal and the glucose rises and the insulin rises higher than it should, then you know that you're creating more insulin to drive that glucose into these becoming resistant cells. And at some point, the insulin becomes higher to a level where it's announcing that we have a problem. But in reality, the problem occurred a decade earlier. In humans, they found that 19, 20-year-old young kids at college with absolutely no evidence of insulin resistance in their blood work, when they took a muscle biopsy, they saw the accumulation of triglycerides inside the muscle cells, which it shouldn't be accumulating. You shouldn't have fat inside the cells other than what's being used to fuel the cell. And they started to see accumulation of triglycerides that were becoming diglycerides. And they determined that that conversion of the three fatty acids on the triglyceride going to diglycerides, or two fatty acids, was actually the trigger to shut down the transport mechanism or close the door to insulin. And that's what led to insulin resistance. And they were able to find this 10 years before any blood work might even suggest that they're becoming insulin resistant. So from this data in humans, I would suggest that even if your insulin levels are normal or look a little high, that your horse could be already insulin resistant. And when you get insulin resistance, you're going to increase the use of amino acids into conversion into glucose for the brain. And when that happens, you're going to start to see PPID or Cushing's disease. And that is a chronic protein deficiency that's occurring secondarily to insulin resistance. So that was a big chunk for you to think about. Maybe some of you are hitting the rewind button and say, just play that again, doc. But that seems to be what's happening in humans. And I'm suggesting, because nobody does any research in horses, because if you don't have a drug or a supplement that you want to promote, no one's going to put money into pure research on horses. And P.S., if you're a billionaire and want to start doing some research on horses, let me know, and let's find some researchers who understand this and just say, let's do the research that's unbiased. Let me do another side note here. When you look at the researchers who are researching research, and you'll probably hear me say this like 100 million times, but when it comes to research, they're now recognizing that when you look at statistics and the pure math of probability and statistics in these research papers, they're realizing that about 95% of most research papers are not significant, and they are not, and they are filled with bias. But as a subset of all research papers, they have looked at all nutrition papers. I mean, every paper written about nutrition, they give it a 0. They say none of it should be believed. It's rife with bias, agendas, and p-values, which is a statistical value that is not nearly high enough to consider that the information they're giving you is statistically significant. And I don't have to show you any of these facts. You know that everything that you read out there is so confusing, so conflicting, and so opposing to one or the other of your beliefs that you're left dazed and confused. And the reason for it is that your gut microbiome and my gut microbiome are completely different. And I've said this a million times, but how do you feed a Shetland pony, Peruvian paso, a Mongolian horse, and an Arab, all living in Houston, Texas? I always say Biloxi, Mississippi, but nobody knows where Biloxi, Mississippi is. But the point is, we have these horses that were genetically raised in various parts of the world, now transported to a different part of the world and forced to eat what's there. And worse, not only forced to eat what's there, but forced to stay within a fence and no longer migrate where they can get a variety of plants. So they're stuck with one or two grasses, and they're supposed to live and thrive. I will say that I find it fascinating. Where was it? It's somewhere in this article. It says, thanks to modern veterinary medicine and better nutrition, horses are living longer than they used to, have more time to develop diseases such as PPID. Oh, I'd love to see the statistics on that. I'd love to go back 1,000 years and say, well, how long did a horse actually live? And we don't know. I mean, they could be 40, 50 years old 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Who's to say? I mean, you look at a great racehorse like Secretariat, who was probably the fastest thoroughbred ever, holds records. People say he's a freak. He had a large heart, an autopsy. I get it. But what did Secretariat die of? He died of metabolic syndrome, of laminitis, and obesity. I got the privilege of seeing Secretariat in his pasture when he's at Claiborne Farm. And I said, oh my gosh, how obese. And he was eating dry leaves on the ground. He was so hungry. And I was just blown away. And I just talked to a veterinarian who actually worked on Secretariat. Yes, as a race horse, when he was running the Belmont. And this veterinarian actually worked on him. And it was just a dichotomy between this incredible athlete that died young and died a horrible death. And it just shouldn't be this way. And as far as I'm concerned, all the good nutrition actually killed the horse prematurely. So I probably don't agree with this author's statement. There's no facts behind it. It just sounds nice, but I don't think it's true. I think in humans, we're seeing that we're living longer. There's less stress in our lives, and that's possible. I get it. I understand where she's coming from, but I don't think we're living a health span. I think that we're living longer, but just looking at statistics, heart disease and obesity and Alzheimer's in humans, I don't think we're living better. And this is what I'm trying to do here to help horses thrive in a human world. I'm trying to bring to light some of these articles that we're getting and just trying to pick them apart. And again, PPID, I think, is secondary to insulin resistance. And if you want to measure insulin resistance, what you really need to do is to fast your horse overnight. So you have what's called a fasting glucose and insulin test. So your veterinarian comes out first thing in the morning, and you know your horse hasn't eaten anything because you kept him in a stall where there's nothing there to eat. And they draw a blood sample to see where the blood glucose and the insulin are. And then the vet or you can administer some Caro syrup, and it's got to be Caro Light. And you put that in the horse. I think it's a couple of ounces. I can't actually remember. Talk to your veterinarian. They need to look this up. And then 60 to 90 minutes later, which a lot of people say 75 minutes later, you draw another sample and see exactly where the blood glucose levels are and where the insulin levels are. And if insulin level is too high, but the glucose is down, you know that you've got a horse that's driving all the glucose into the glycogen storage, but it's having an overreactive insulin response. And you know that you're marching on toward full-fledged, full-blown insulin resistance. But if you have glucose and insulin that's both are remaining higher than normal, then you have full-fledged insulin resistance, and the glucose keeps circulating. And keep in mind that whenever you start to make more fat inside a cell, when you're driving all this glucose into conversion into the free fatty acids and triglycerides that are stuffed into the fat cell and obesity is occurring, there is a release of cytokines. And cytokines are those cells that we've heard about with COVID, with the cytokine storm. These are inflammatory products. And the more inflammation that's occurring, the more disease that we get. And in humans, it usually lands in the heart. And this is why we have so much heart disease in obese humans. But my presumption, my best guess, is that that inflammation that's being caused by fat storage is actually being reactive within the lamina of the hooves. And this is why most horses that have laminitis are also having this metabolic increase in fat production. Now, that said, I often have said to people that I've never seen laminitis in a skinny horse, but I take that back because there are some skinny horses that are insulin resistant in a big way. And that's a paradox that I'm having trouble understanding why we're having insulin resistance and yet we don't have body fat production. And I think that there are some horses out there that have this inability to drive the glucose into fat storage. And it's something that's worth more thought of. And I will think about it over the years and come up with an answer. But just because your horse is skinny doesn't mean that he can't get laminitis if he's one of those horses and you keep feeding him sugar. All right. Tips for low risk horses. And then they have another section, tips for high risk horses. And throughout this article, they talk about pasture management and making sure that the horse is limited and that you're testing your horse for ACTH. And again, if you're testing your ACTH, you're really behind the 8 ball. I mean, it's really easy to draw blood on it. And it's a lot harder for a veterinarian to to dose a horse and then come back 75 minutes later, especially if you live an hour away from the veterinarian. What's the vet going to do for an hour and a half as they're waiting for your horse to get ready for the second blood sample? So it's not a very practical test, but it truly is the only valid test for insulin and blood glucose. You could also test for blood triglycerides. And if they become too high, you know that you have circulating fat. But again, if you see your horse is obese, that's probably what's happening. But the tips for the low risk horses is basically are the horses eating like there's no tomorrow. They said, do they ever come up for air? Or is their head buried in grass the whole time? I want to introduce you to a hypothesis that you can look up on the web called protein leverage hypothesis, which states in humans and also in lab animals that the satiation or the satiety of an animal is based on their accumulation of amino acids throughout the day. So their suggestion is that as you eat enough protein, then you're no longer worried about eating. You become satisfied. That's what satiation means. So satiation is driven by multiple factors. Your leptin levels, which is a hormone that indicates that you're satisfied. And you can get leptin resistance just like you can get insulin resistance when you eat sugar constantly. But in this case, they're talking about protein. It's called the protein leverage hypothesis. And by increasing the amount of protein that you eat and consume during the day, you can actually satiate your body so you're no longer hungry. And I think that's pretty fascinating. So I've tried it, and I found that some of these minis that were muzzling to limit their grass intake no longer need to be muzzled. We see some ponies that once you reestablish the amount of protein that's in their body, but more importantly, decrease the amount of protein loss by removing the starches in their diet, they become more satiated and they are not hunger driven. And remember, the paradigm that I'm trying to throw out here is when you see a horse that seems hungry all the time, as the article suggests, the head is buried in the grass, it never comes up for air. It could be that the horse is actually searching for something, that they're not hungry, that they're missing something. And we know that grasses don't have all the amino acids they need. And last summer's grass, which everyone calls hay, that also is missing the protein. It doesn't have a full protein spectrum that we need to maintain the muscle and the neurotransmitters and the enzymes and the hormones and the connective tissues. And so they're constantly looking for something. And so we interpret that as hungry all the time. And I believe that it should be a paradigm shift that if you can stop the protein loss through this conversion of proteins into glucose in the liver and start replacing some of the lost proteins with a high quality protein source that has all the amino acids that grasses don't have, then your horse will start to become satiated and reduce that. I want to also throw in another interesting idea that I already told you, but I'm going to come back to it. And that insulin resistance is a normal process to conserve glucose for the brain. And it was created by the DNA that's in our bodies to become active in a case of starvation. And when a horse becomes insulin resistant, they conserve this glucose. So when you put a muzzle on, or you put a pony in a dry lot, or you only give them one flake of hay and you're on the starvation diet because we're going to melt that fat away, you're actually increasing insulin resistance, which is going to increase blood glucose, which is going to cause more fat production on whatever you're feeding them. And there's still a chance of having these cytokines being released, which includes interleukin 6 and tissue necrosis factor, for those of you out there interested in what a cytokine is. And I think they can also have some problems with the lamina. So if you're starving your horse and your horse still gets a little bit of soreness in the feet, it could be because you're starving them. So where does that leave us in getting the horses taken care of? Well, the article goes on to basically say, starve the horse, put muzzles on them, reduce the amount of pasture they have access to, but nowhere does it say reduce the amount of hay. And it blows my mind that people feed hay to horses that have bountiful pasture. I mean, horses that are on grass that's growing don't need hay. They need to reduce their body fat, and through reduction of body fat, you're going to normalize the insulin. The only way you can stop insulin from being produced is to stop consuming sugar. It's just that simple. It's been proven a million times. Stop the glucose intake, stop the starch intake, stop feeding carrots, and the insulin levels will start to come down. And once they come down, then the horse can convert the body fat over to fuel for the muscles, which the horse muscles actually prefer as a fuel. So if your horse isn't too lame, you can increase the exercise, increase the activity, hook the mini up to a cart and start making it work, pulling you around, the neighborhood. Try to increase their exercise to the point where they're huffing and puffing a little bit. And you don't have to do it every day. Don't go overboard on this. Just once, maybe twice a week, get the exercise up, because what that does is it actually signals a backdoor into the cell. And this is so fascinating because we all think that our muscle cells need insulin to bring glucose into it. And that's true for most horses. But when they're being worked hard, now they know they need to fill in the cell with glucose at all costs, because you never know when the next tiger is going to come around, and they don't want to depend on insulin. So they open up a backdoor channel, and glucose can actually come in the backdoor channel to fill in the glycogen and actually be used. So remember, glucose has to be disposed of in three ways. One is stored as glycogen, two is being burned up within the muscle cell, and three, being converted into body fat. And if you're working all the time, you will be using glucose for energy. But if you're not working all the time, the horses become more sedentary. The horse prefers fat for fuel. And the most healthy muscle that you can have should be able to be flexible to go back and forth between fat and glucose. And the more you can flex that by limiting the sugar and then allowing a little bit of sugar in and working the horse hard, you'll be able to get that mitochondria, which is that structure inside the cell, which we call the furnace. It can become flexible and use both fuels. So that's basically everything in a nutshell here on this article. And take home message, they say, if you're determined your horse is at low risk for developing laminitis, and you can manage pasture quality and quantity, then by all means give him access to it. Grazing is one of the best things a horse can do. Grass fulfills almost all the protein requirements. I totally disagree with that. What she wants to say is, if a horse has the ability to migrate past your fence line and start eating some of the things that are not in your pasture and migrating several states away or into another country, if you're in Europe, it's going to have a broad variety of ground plants, and that will give all the proteins it needs. But for 99.99% of us who keep our horses behind a fence that have a mono grass pasture, or maybe several grasses in there, but they're limited, they are not going to get all the protein needs they need. The amino acid profiles are too low. So I disagree with that completely. Let's see. It says, grass fulfills almost all the protein requirements. I love the almost. A slight, underwhelming word. Calories. Okay, I agree that they're going to get calories, but calories are irrelevant. Most people who now understand nutrition realize that when you see the calorie count on the fast food restaurant, when you're sitting there, donut, 450 calories. Okay, that's going to be more important than a couple of tablespoonfuls of pure coconut oil, MCT oil, that has 360 calories and it's going to be completely used differently. I mean, just totally differently used by your body. And so calories actually don't count. Let's see what else. Oh, and vitamins that a horse needs. I find that fascinating because the vitamins are built by the microbes in the gut. I believe that. I don't believe that they need to ingest the vitamins. I think vitamins are truly made by the horse's gut. I know in humans we need to take vitamin C, but we're primates and we eat mostly meat. Some of us don't eat meat at all, but horses are true herbivores or vegetarians, if you will, and they have to eat a lot of ground plants. And those ground plants nourish the bacteria in that huge tank they carry between their legs and their belly. And the bacteria can make all the vitamins they need. The final paragraph says, with high-risk horses, remember that grazing risks don't disappear at the end of the spring, and every horse must be managed as an individual. I absolutely agree with that. You have to look at each horse as an individual. If the insulin stays high, there are some horses that just can't ever graze on grass again. Well, if the insulin levels stay high, it's because you're feeding glucose. And again, if you want to get insulin levels low, it will respond to the amount of glucose you're putting in the mouth. And remember, horses do not need starch. All animals don't need starch to survive. They need glucose to keep the brain going, but they don't need to be consuming starch. You and I and your horse can make all the glucose it needs by this process in the liver. The difference is if you feed too much glucose, you're going to actually increase that process, and that's not going to work well. If you take in a little bit of glucose, that's going to be disposed of in the muscle cells as glycogen and in the liver as glycogen. And so you don't have to be breaking down your substrates in your body, specifically the amino acids, to make the glucose. So now the horse is now balanced, if you will. Everybody loves the word balanced. Or I like the word flexible. It means the horse is going to be using both fat and glucose for fuel. And remember, the cellulose of ground plants, in this case, hay and pasture, is an excellent source of fat for the horse. And the horse should be having that. Just wash the hay out, soak it in water, get the glucose out of there, and limit the amount of turnout the horse has if you think that the horse is getting too obese. But remember, in wintertime, you don't have to be feeding hay until the horse says, hey, I'm getting a little thin here and it's getting really cold out. I sure could use a little bit more energy, and that can come in the form of hay. You don't need to be feeding half a bale per horse per day or 20 pounds of hay to a horse that's also out on pasture, because you're going to be increasing the fat stores. And over time, year after year, the horse will become fatter and fatter and fatter. And then at some point, you're going to start seeing signs of insulin resistance or PPID. And this has been going on for 10 years. And you need to stop it now. So if your horse doesn't have any signs of problems, like he's a yearling, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and he's running around the pasture and he's looking good, keep him that way. If your horse is getting chunky and you're starting to see the fat pads, you start to see a crusty neck, slow down on the sugar intake. It's that simple, because all that sugar that's going into that horse's mouth is being converted over to body fat. All right, so that's my analysis of this this green grass article on the horse. I think that gives you some more insights. And again, I find it fascinating that here's an article on green pasture and horses that are metabolically unfit. And they never talk about stop feeding hay, keep the hay in water, to soak out the sugars, decrease the amount of pasture access through either strip or movement. A lot of people put these tracks in on their pasture, so the horse has to move from one spot to the next to get something. Just remember that starvation also creates insulin resistance. That's the purpose of insulin resistance. And that most horses at this point are protein deficient, chronically protein deficient. If you have PPID, your horse is well beyond. And if you're not doing an oral glucose tolerance test, you're not really getting a true assessment of the horse's insulin. So that pretty much sums it up. I know that I've given you a lot. I could talk about so many other things, but I get these articles, and there's another article in here that I'm going to address in another podcast. And I'm going to try to be the advocate for you guys so you can read these things and then understand it and say, okay, is this a valid thing or not? By the way, some of the quotes in there were from a person whose job is at a major grain company, which I thought was fascinating, as well as another person who's very good at what she does as a professor. But I think her quotes are a little bit taken out of context to make the article flow a little bit better. So that's the problem with articles. They all are agenda driven. They're focused on one thing, and they tend to leave a lot of other things out. Try to make things simple, but through simplicity, they actually make it more complicated and doesn't help your horse at all. So that's my job. That's why I'm here. That's why you're here. You're listening to me. And I appreciate the time you spent with me today on this. If you want more information, always just go to thehorsesadvocate.com, thehorsesadvocate.com, and look at all the information that we put on there. These podcasts I put up there for free. If you want to have a discussion, if you want to start asking a bunch of questions, if you want to dig deeper, if you want to get some of the courses, you can always become a member. The member helps pay for the website and all the time that's put into committed to making these things happen. So I would love it if you thought about becoming a member, even if it's for a month, just to see what's going on. Check out all the information there. All right. Thank you very much. Pass this information on to somebody else. I always appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. Thanks a lot. Bye. Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.